Hey everyone, let's dive into something we all do but rarely think about historically: sleep. Specifically, how people in the Middle Ages handled their nightly rest in ways that might seem bizarre to us today. Before we get started, if you enjoy this deep dive into the past, give the video a thumbs up and hit subscribe. It really helps keep the channel going. Drop a comment below to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always cool to connect with you all across the globe. Now, grab a cozy blanket, maybe turn on some ambient white noise, and let's step back in time to explore a sleep schedule that would leave modern insomniacs scratching their heads. Long before smartphones, sleep apps, or even electric lights, medieval folks followed a fascinating sleep pattern called biphasic or segmented sleep. This wasn't a quirky habit, it was the norm. A two-act slumber that split the night like a loaf of day-old bread. Picture this. As the sun dipped below the horizon, most people, peasants, merchants, even monks, would settle down for what was called the first sleep around 8 or 9 p.m. They'd drift off for about 3 to 4 hours, then, almost like clockwork, wake up in the middle of the night for a period known as the watch. This wasn't a glitch in their sleep cycle, it was intentional, expected, and surprisingly productive. During this midnight intermission, lasting 1 to 2 hours, people engaged in a variety of activities that sound oddly charming today. Many use the time for quiet reflection or prayer, especially in religious households where reciting psalms or meditating on scripture was common. Others might stoke the fire to keep the house warm, check on animals to ensure the chickens weren't staging a midnight escape, or even catch up on small chores. Historical records, like those from 14th century England, suggest some people used this time for writing letters or reading by candlelight if they could afford it. And yes, this was also considered prime time for romance. Medieval texts, including medical treatises like those by the 13th century physician Arnauld de Villanova, claimed the body was in an optimal state, rested yet relaxed, making it ideal for intimacy. So, while we might plan a date night over dinner, our ancestors were apparently scheduling theirs at 1 a.m. After this wakeful interlude, people slipped back into the second sleep, snoozing until dawn. This rhythm was so ingrained that it pops up in historical texts across Europe, from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to 15th century French diaries. Even religious schedules, like those of Benedictine monks, were built around this biphasic pattern, with nighttime prayers often timed for the watch period. What's wild is that modern science backs this up. Research from the 1990s by historian Roger Eckerch and sleep studies like those conducted by the National Institute of Mental Health suggest that without artificial light, humans naturally gravitate towards segmented sleep. Our circadian rhythms, unshackled from the glow of screens or streetlights, may favor 2 shorter sleep blocks over 1 long one. So if you're tossing and turning at 3 a.m., don't stress. You might just be channeling your inner medieval peasant. Maybe light a candle and ponder your life choices instead. This biphasic sleep pattern started to fade with the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. The rise of factories, rigid work schedules, and artificial lighting, first gas, then electric, pushed society toward the 8-hour sleep ideal we chase today. Suddenly, waking up in the middle of the night was labeled a problem, not a feature. Medieval people, though, didn't see it that way. To them, the watch was as routine as brushing your teeth is to us, a built-in part of the night that everyone, from laborers to lords, followed. Now, let's talk about where medieval people laid their heads, their beds, or what passed for them. In our world, we're spoiled with ergonomic pillows, weighted blankets, and mattresses that promised to cradle us like a dream. In the Middle Ages, beds were less about luxury and more about survival. For the average peasant, a bed was often a pallet, a sack stuffed with straw, hay, or sometimes dried leaves, laid directly on the floor. If they were lucky, the sack was made of coarse linen or hemp, but many just slept on loose straw, which was cheap, insulating, and abundant. The downside? These pallets were a magnet for pests. Fleas, lice, and even the occasional adventurous mouse could turn your bed into a miniature ecosystem. A 14th century English household manual advised regularly shaking out bedding to keep creeping things at bay. But let's be real, if it crawled, you probably just learned to live with it. For those with a bit more coin, a simple wooden frame might elevate the pallet off the cold, damp floor, reducing but not eliminating the pest problem. This was a small win, as stone or dirt floors in medieval homes could be brutally chilly, especially in winter. Linen sheets were a rare luxury, reserved for the slightly better off, and pajamas weren't a thing. Most people slept in their day clothes, think tunics and shifts, or sometimes nothing at all. Personal space? Also not a thing. Entire families, from infants to grandparents, often piled onto the same pallet or shared a single room. A 15th century Italian traveler, Leonardo da Pistoia, noted sleeping arrangements in rural homes where, quote, all breathed the same air, man and child alike, which sounds less cozy than crowded. Nobles, of course, had it better. Their beds were status symbols, massive wooden frames, sometimes carved with intricate designs, topped with feather or wool mattresses for extra cushioning. These were draped with heavy curtains or canopies to block drafts and, in theory, pests. Linen or even silk sheets, often embroidered, added a touch of decadence. A 1390 inventory from a French noble's estate lists a bed with crimson velvet curtains and goose feather stuffing, showing just how lavish these setups could be. Yet, even for the elite, beds were rarely private. Servants or retainers might sleep nearby, ready to leap up if their lord sneezed. Imagine inheriting not a sprawling estate, but your great-aunt's feather mattress, complete with mysterious lumps and a faint musty odor. In the Middle Ages, beds were so valuable they were often named in wills, prized as much as land for their role in keeping you warm and slightly less miserable. For most people, a bed wasn't a haven of comfort. It was a shield against the cold, a barrier from wandering livestock, and a faint hope of dreaming about a life with a mattress that didn't crunch when you rolled over. Now, picture the term nightcap. Today, it might evoke a warm drink by a crackling fire, maybe with a splash of whiskey and a hint of regret. In medieval times, a nightcap was far more practical, a literal hat to keep your head from freezing during the night. Medieval homes were drafty affairs. Stone walls, leaky thatched roofs, and windows of thin horn or oiled parchment did little to block the chill. With no central heating, unless you count a dog napping at your feet, body heat escaping through the scalp was a real problem. Nightcaps, often crafted from wool or scraps of linen, came in all shapes, from simple domes to long, pointed cones that could double as a prop for a sorcerer's costume. A 15th century Dutch painting shows a scholar asleep in one, looking both cozy and slightly ridiculous. These caps weren't just about warmth, they carried social meaning. In many areas, married women were expected to cover their hair at all times, even in bed, to uphold modesty. A 13th century French cleric's writing warned that uncovered hair could stir unseemly thoughts, so nightcaps doubled as a moral safeguard.
Wealthier families might flaunt caps dyed in rich colors or stitched with intricate patterns, turning bedtime into a subtle flex of status. In towns, opening your door in a nightcap signaled you were off duty, a polite medieval equivalent of muting your Zoom call. These hats often paired with nightshirts, long, baggy tunics that were practical but scratchy, like wearing a flour sack with ambition. Fire hazards near open hearths made them a risky choice, but they beat sleeping in your muddy day clothes.
Then there's the wildest part of medieval sleep, sharing a bed with strangers. Today, sleeping next to someone unknown is the stuff of turbulent flights or a poorly planned hostel stay. In the Middle Ages, it was standard practice. If you were a traveler, a peddler, a pilgrim, or just someone whose horse gave out halfway to Lincoln, you'd likely end up at an inn. These weren't charming guest houses, but chaotic sleep hubs. A private bed was a fantasy. Instead, you'd be squeezed into a mattress already hosting one or more strangers. A 14th century English chronicle describes inn beds holding 3 or 4 weary souls, packed in like sardines with no regard for personal space. This wasn't considered rude, it was resourceful. Inns maximized beds, and you took what you got. In bigger cities, you might end up in a hall lined with beds, where snoring was a symphony and blanket wars were unspoken battles. Some inns tried sorting sleepers by trade, masons with masons, monks with monks, but most were a free-for-all.
A 15th century Italian merchant's diary recounts sharing a bed with a cobbler who muttered of leather all night. Gender separation happened in fancier establishments, but rural taverns often mixed everyone together. For medieval travelers, this beat curling up in a field with rain and bandits as company. Theft was a constant worry, so many slept with purses tied to their waists or bags under their heads as makeshift alarms. A 13th century German guide for pilgrims advised keeping valuables close lest you wake to find them gone. The wealthy, naturally, avoided this chaos, traveling with their own portable beds, lavish frames and bedding hauled along to spare them the indignity of spooning a stranger. So, as you sink into your plush mattress tonight, savor the solitude, the clean sheets, and the absence of a pointy nightcap. Medieval sleep was a gritty adventure, from lumpy beds to crowded inns. But it reveals how our ancestors turned rest into a test of resilience, one shared blanket and itchy cap at a time. For the elite, travel meant sleeping in style.
Nobles roamed with entourages, setting up lavish camps with cushioned bedding or demanding private chambers at inns, assuming the innkeeper valued their roof staying intact. But for everyone in the Middle Ages, bedtime was more than just slipping under a blanket. It was a nightly ritual laced with spiritual stakes, a moment to brace for the possibility that you might not wake up. Forget soothing chamomile tea or white noise machines. Medieval people prepared for sleep like it was a high-stakes mission to safeguard their eternal soul. Death was a constant shadow in the medieval world. Plague, fire, bandits, or simply being over 30 in 1250 could end you before sunrise. So bedtime became a time for spiritual housekeeping. Instead of winding down with a book or a podcast, people turned to prayers, confessions, and sacred rituals to ensure their soul was ready for an unscheduled meeting with the afterlife. Hell wasn't just a concept, it was a vivid fire and brimstone terror, and no one wanted to arrive there unprepared.
A popular prayer, still familiar today, went something like, "If I perish before morning, may my soul find divine mercy." It sounds sweet until you realize it's essentially a child's plea for cosmic insurance against death by dawn. Adults had an arsenal of prayers tailored to specific fears. One for guilt over a petty sin, another for warding off demons lurking in the shadows. and even one for dodging the plague, though that one didn't exactly work miracles. A 14th century English prayer book lists invocations to saints like Saint Michael, seen as celestial protectors who stood guard over sleeping souls like divine sentinels. The devout took it further. Monks and nuns capped their day with Compline, the final liturgical prayer before bed, often followed by a vow of silence. This wasn't hard to keep. After a day of labor, meager meals, and the ever-present fear of the dark, silence came naturally. Children were roped into the ritual too, taught to pray not just for their souls, but to keep busy instead of pestering about why the family goat was snoring nearby.
Parents spun tales of angels watching over them, which might sound comforting, until you realize it was less about cuddly guardians and more about an all-seeing divine watchdog. Bedtime prayers weren't about inner peace. They were a frantic, last-minute effort to patch up the soul, like running antivirus software on a creaky old computer and hoping it holds. Dreams, meanwhile, were no mere brain static. Today, we might blame a wild dream on stress or a late-night snack, but in the Middle Ages, dreams were serious business, portals to divine messages, demonic traps, or cryptic warnings from a saint you accidentally offended. A 12th century text by Hildegard of Bingen describes dreams as windows to the soul's journey, where God, angels, or even the devil might drop in with a message. Dreamed of a glowing cross? That's a divine nod. Dreamed of a shadowy figure or a river flooding your village? Time to call a priest and maybe skip dinner for a few days. Entire books, like the 13th century Onirikrutikon of Daniel, were dedicated to decoding dreams. Fire might signal eternal punishment. Water could hint at cleansing or disaster. A bizarre vision of a goat-headed figure tossing apples? You'd better start fasting and hope it wasn't a personal invitation to hell. Medieval people believed the soul stayed active during sleep, so dreams weren't just random. They could expose hidden sins or spiritual cracks. A dream about sneaking an extra slice of bread might betray real-world greed or just hunger pangs, but either way, it was confession material. Monks and nuns meticulously recorded their dreams, sharing them with abbots or abbesses. Some, like Saint Teresa of Avila, were praised for visions of divine encounters. Others were gently advised to lay off the heavy stew. Dreams also fueled medieval literature, serving as plot engines where knights met spectral guides or cryptic beasts delivering moral lectures in verse. Think of it as the era's version of a streaming service, but with heavier symbolism and no skip button.
The church, ever cautious, cast a wary eye on dreams. Not every vision was holy. Some were suspected to be demonic ploys to lure the faithful astray. A 14th century sermon warned that impure dreams might signal a spiritual attack, though sleeping near a smoky hearth could also be to blame. If your dream felt too vivid or too tempting, you might wake up questioning your soul's security settings. So as you tuck into your soft bed tonight, free of drafty walls or existential dread, appreciate the simplicity of modern sleep. Medieval people faced the night armed with prayers, guarded by saints, and haunted by dreams that could be divine, demonic, or just last night's onions talking back. Picture letting your dog curl up at the foot of your bed today, a cozy, if slightly furry choice. In the Middle Ages, sharing a bed with animals wasn't a cute quirk, it was a survival tactic. Medieval homes were far from toasty. Stone walls, zero insulation, and drafts so fierce they could snuff out a candle made warmth a precious commodity.
Central heating? That was the family cow or a pig dozing by the fire. In peasant households, humans and livestock often shared the same space, sometimes the same straw pile that passed for a bed. Chickens strutted across the floor, dogs nestled against your legs, and pigs huffed contentedly nearby.
If you were lucky, none of them mistook your toes for a midnight snack. This wasn't about bonding with pets, though medieval folks valued their animals. It was about harnessing their body heat. A hefty dog could keep your feet from turning the ice, while a cow in the corner might nudge the room's temperature up just enough to make a winter night bearable. A 14th century English manor record notes a farmer keeping 2 hounds and a sow in his sleeping quarters for warmth, a practical, if pungent, arrangement. Peasant homes were typically one-room affairs, where cooking, eating, sleeping, and the occasional farewell to life all happened in the same cramped space.
You might find yourself wedged between your spouse, a toddler, and a curious goat, with a rooster doubling as an overzealous alarm clock. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. Best not to dwell on it. Wealthier households kept things slightly more refined. Nobles rarely bunked with livestock, though they might allow a pampered lapdog to share their bed, less for warmth and more for status. A 15th century French noblewoman's diary mentions her spaniel sleeping on a velvet cushion beside her, partly for fashion and partly to draw fleas away from her skin. In grand castles, favorite animals sometimes had their own sleeping quarters, complete with embroidered bedding, a flex that screamed, "My dog outranks your entire village." Of course, animals weren't perfect bedmates. They snorted, scratched, and had a knack for ignoring personal boundaries. A stray hoof or beak at 3 a.m. was just part of the deal, and medieval sleepers rolled with it. If you've ever grumbled about a crowded hostel dorm, brace yourself for the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort was a sin and personal space was a fantasy.
Monks slept in large open halls, lined up in rows like pious sardines on wooden planks. If the abbot was in a generous mood, you might get a thin straw mat, but don't count on it. A 13th century monastic rule from Cluny describes beds as boards of oak, unadorned to humble the flesh. Monks slept in their full habits, robes, belts, even sandals, not for modesty, but to save time when stumbling out for midnight prayers. Blankets were sparse, pillows were non-existent, and silence was mandatory under the rule of Saint Benedict. Groan too loudly, or heaven forbid, snore, and you might be scrubbing pots as penance. Candlelight was scarce, one flickering flame if you were lucky, because seeing wasn't the point. The goal was to lie still, avoid temptation, and keep your soul on the straight and narrow. Monastic life saw sleep as a necessary evil, not a luxury. Beds were designed to discipline the body, preparing the soul for eternity by denying earthly comforts.
Some monks took it to extremes, sleeping upright to shun any hint of indulgence, as noted in a 12th century Cistercian text praising such austerity as a ladder to heaven. Compared to this, a peasant straw pile with a snoring pig sounds like a 5-star resort. At least the pig didn't glare at you for dreaming too vividly. Speaking of extreme, imagine waking up at 2 a.m., not for a snack or a quick scroll through your phone, but for a bone-chilling candlelit prayer session. In monasteries, this was standard. Monks rose in the dead of night for the office of matins or lauds, chanting psalms in a cold, echoing chapel. A 14th century Benedictine schedule from Canterbury details these pre-dawn prayers as a shield against the terrors of the night. For medieval sleepers, both monks and lay people, the night was a battleground where faith, survival, and the occasional wayward animal shaped their rest. So, as you snuggle into your heated blanket tonight, free from goats or midnight chants, be grateful for a sleep routine that doesn't double as a spiritual or thermal endurance test.
In medieval monasteries, the night wasn't for restful slumber. It was for spiritual vigilance. Monks and nuns lived by the canonical hours, a grueling schedule of prayers that kicked off with matins, The first service held in the pitch-black depths of night, when even the bats were still tucked in. A bell, rung by some unlucky soul, would shatter the silence, summoning a dormitory of bleary-eyed, robed figures to shuffle to the chapel. No cozy pajamas here, just the same rough habit they'd worn all day, layered with nothing but faith. In the dim glow of a few candles, under soaring stone arches, they chanted psalms and recited scriptures, struggling to stay upright. Dozing off was a real risk. A 13th century chronicle from a French abbey records monks disciplined for nodding off during matins, sentenced to extra scrubbing or leading the next bone-chilling service. Matins could drag on for an hour, sometimes two in zealous houses, while hunger gnawed. Last night's meal was likely a thin gruel and a sermon on humility.
Afterward, some monks crawled back to their planks for a second sleep, but stricter orders sent them straight to study or labor, like hauling grain on a few hours of fractured rest. Why the pre-dawn ordeal? It was about offering the quietest, most temptation-free hours to God, a sacrifice of comfort that proved devotion. Numb toes, smoky air, and the monk next door's shaky pitch were just part of the deal. Today, sleeping alone is a badge of independence, a chance to hog the covers in peace. In the Middle Ages, though, a solitary bed was odd, impractical, even risky. Warmth was the first concern. With drafty stone walls and chimneys that did more to invite cold than trap heat, medieval homes were frigid. Central heating was centuries off, so people piled into beds together, not for bonding, but for raw survival. Siblings, parents, kids, even the neighbor's cousin might share a straw mat, turning bedtime into an involuntary huddle. A 14th century German household account describes a family of 6, plus a dog, sharing one bed to keep the frost at bay.
Beyond warmth, there was a spiritual angle. The night was the devil's playground, and sleeping alone left your soul exposed to temptation. Or worse, demonic visitors. A 12th century English folktale warned that solitary sleepers risked being snatched by spirits, a fear that kept children nestled close to family. These weren't cozy bedtime stories with happy endings. They were grim tales of vanishing souls. Even married couples rarely slept alone. Their beds might include kids, servants, or a stray guest passing through. Privacy was a foreign concept. 2 people in a sprawling bed would have seemed wasteful or downright shady. In monasteries, communal sleeping was the norm, with monks packed into dormitory halls for accountability. Sleeping alone was rare and often a punishment, as a 13th century Benedictine text notes, reserved for those needing to reflect on their failings in solitude. The logic? Group sleeping kept sin in check. A lone bed invited mischief. So next time you savor your quiet, goat-free bedroom, thank your stars you're not bunking with a snoring dog, a restless toddler, and your second cousin, all competing for the blanket.
Then there's the peculiar habit of sleeping upright, a choice some medieval folks, especially the wealthy or devout, made deliberately. If you've ever dozed off in a lecture hall or a bumpy cart and woken with a stiff neck, you know it's not exactly restful. Yet for some, it was a way of life, driven by reasons as practical as they were punishing. A 15th century Italian medical manual advised sleeping propped up to aid digestion or breathing, especially for nobles with rich diets. For the devout, it was about denying the body's desire for ease, aligning with spiritual discipline. A 14th century mystic, Marjorie Kemp, wrote of sleeping half upright to mortify the flesh and stay vigilant for divine visions. Whether for health or holiness, upright sleeping was less about comfort and more about endurance, a reminder that even rest could be a test of resolve. In the Middle Ages, lying flat to sleep wasn't always the goal. Some preferred to prop themselves up, and not for the sake of comfort.
Medical wisdom of the time, rooted in the theory of bodily humors, held that reclining fully could disrupt digestion, clog the lungs, or throw your entire system out of whack. A 14th century Italian physician, Taddeo Alderotti, warned that lying flat risked flooding the brain with ill humors, which could mean anything from a headache to flame overload. Beyond health, there was a spiritual angle. Lying flat mimicked the posture of a corpse, which was a risky look in a world where death was always lurking. A 13th century sermon from France cautioned that a fully reclined sleeper might catch the eye of the angel of death, mistaking you for someone ready to check out. Superstition? Sure, but when your priest was also your go-to doctor, you didn't argue. Instead, people slept propped up with bolsters, pillows, or wooden headboards. Think of it as a medieval recliner, minus the footrest. Nobles had beds with slanted frames to keep them semi-upright, ideal for digesting a heavy venison stew or warding off any demons eyeing their soul. Monks in stricter orders went further, sometimes sleeping seated on a bench or leaning against a chilly stone wall, their hoods the only buffer against discomfort. A 12th century Cistercian text praises this as a penance to keep the spirit alert. Comfort invited dreams, dreams invited sin, and sin meant an early morning confession marathon. Rest wasn't the point, discipline was. If that sounds grim, brace yourself for the real nightmare of medieval sleep, the pests. Forget spooky stories or monsters under the bed. The true terrors were already in the sheets, and they were tiny, relentless, and hungry. Fleas, lice, and the dreaded bedbug were the uninvited guests of every medieval bedroom. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. Baths were a luxury. Laundry was a chore, and soap could be a questionable mix of ash and animal fat. Combine that with straw-stuffed mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional rooster wandering through, and you had a pest paradise. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically family. Even nobles, with their silk sheets and feather beds, weren't spared. A 15th century English court record mentions a noblewoman employing lice pickers to comb through her hair and clothing, a job as glamorous as it sounds. Bedbugs were the stealthier menace, lurking in bed frames, mattress crevices, and wall cracks, emerging at night for a blood buffet. Nightcaps and heavy nightshirts doubled as pest armor, not just warmth. People fought back with creative, if dubious, solutions. Some burned pungent herbs like mugwort or lavender to drive bugs away, as advised in a 14th century French household manual. Others tucked garlic or ashes into their bedding, which might not have repelled pests, but definitely kept amorous intentions at bay. Pests weren't just a nuisance. They carried symbolic weight. A 13th century sermon likened fleas to stings of sin, biting reminders to remind you of your moral failings. Entire ballads were composed about fleas, some moralizing, others oddly romantic, weaving tales of shared bites as a bond between lovers. So, while today's sleepless nights might be blamed on glowing screens, medieval sleepers were more likely tormented by itching, scratching, and the creepy crawlies on their skin, because they were very real. Now imagine trying to sleep in a full suit of armor. 100 pounds of clanking iron. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Yet, in the Middle Ages, some warriors did just that, or at least close to it. Full plate armor wasn't typically bedtime attire. It was heavy, sweaty, and about as cozy as a toolbox. But in wartime or hostile lands, knights and soldiers might sleep in partial armor, like chainmail or a breastplate, prioritizing survival over comfort.
A 14th century chronicle of the Hundred Years' War describes knights camping in half armor to stay battle-ready, even at rest. Rolling over in chainmail was like trying to nap in a sack of spoons, loud, awkward, and not remotely restful. Still, when bandits or enemy scouts could strike at any moment, a little discomfort was better than a midnight ambush. On a battlefield or during a tense campaign, a knight might strip off only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his chainmail or breastplate on for the night.
This wasn't about comfort, but readiness, ensuring he could leap into action if enemies decided to crash the camp at midnight. A 14th century French chronicle describes knights sleeping in half harness during the Hundred Years' War, roused by hoofbeats and forced to fight while still groggy from dreams of harvests or feasts. In besieged castles, men-at-arms went further, dozing with swords or axes within arm's reach. Think of them as lethal teddy bears. Shields often doubled as makeshift pillows, offering a hard but battle-ready headrest. If the walls were breached, at least you were already dressed for the occasion. Sleeping in armor was far from restful. Chainmail pinched like a cranky crab, and plate armor trapped heat like a portable oven. Add stone floors, thin bedding, and the symphony of snoring comrades and flickering torches, and you've got a sleep setup that makes a modern airport lounge seem like a spa. Even outside of war, travelers like merchants or guards in dicey regions might sleep in gambesons, padded jackets that offered light protection and a touch more cushion than faith alone. But armor wasn't subtle.
One wrong roll could unleash a clatter loud enough to wake the camp, sparking panic that the end times had arrived early. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation to sound scholarly, was no mere quirk in the Middle Ages. It was a full-blown mystery tinged with dread. If you rose from your straw mat, wandered the room, and stared blankly into the dark, your neighbors didn't blame stress or a bad diet. They suspected possession, witchcraft, or some unresolved feud with a saint. A 13th century English court record recounts a villager sleepwalking through his hamlet, muttering gibberish and terrifying onlookers who assumed he was touched by spirits. Exorcisms were sometimes ordered before dawn, just to be safe. Medieval medicine pinned sleepwalking on imbalanced humors, particularly an excess of black bile, the go-to explanation for anything puzzling. Others believed the soul slipped its leash during sleep, leaving the body to stumble around like a lost ox.
To curb these nighttime escapades, people tried everything. Herbal tonics, prayers over the bed, iron talismans nailed above door frames, or in rural areas, tying a sleeper's ankle to a post. Extreme? Maybe. But with open hearths, stray knives, and chamber pots waiting to be kicked over, precautions made sense. A 14th century Italian tale tells of a sleepwalker climbing onto a roof, sparking village debates about whether unconscious sins counted in the eyes of God. Most sleepwalkers just paced or fumbled with imaginary locks, but if one wandered into a church, it could be hailed as divine intervention or trigger a purification ritual to hedge all bets. Despite the chaos, medieval people became masters of sleeping through noise that would jolt us awake today. Church bells were the loudest culprits, ringing for sunrise, prayers, meals, and, of course, matins at an unholy 2 a.m. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams were punctuated by relentless tolling, as noted in a 15th century German monk's diary complaining of bells that pierce the soul's rest. Eventually, the brain tuned them out, turning clangs into a strange lullaby. But bells were just the start. Thunderstorms, bleating livestock, and the distant clamor of a siege were the medieval equivalent of white noise.
A 13th century French villager's account describes sleeping through goats wailing and bells chiming, as if it were nothing. For medieval sleepers, rest was less about silence and more about resilience, a skill honed in beds shared with pigs, pests, and the ever-present din of a world that never quite settled down. Medieval life didn't pause for a good night's sleep, no matter how wild the night got. Storms roared through, with no warning, no weather apps, no double-paned windows, just thunder that shook the soul and roofs that leaked like sieves. Chimneys wailed, shutters clattered, and yet people dozed on. They had no choice. Plowing fields, dodging bandits, or praying for salvation didn't wait for a full 8 hours. A 14th century chronicle from Flanders describes villagers sleeping through tempests that tore at the thatch, their bodies too exhausted to care.
Even apocalyptic chaos, famines, wars, the Black Death, couldn't always keep eyes open. During the plague, death carts creaking through dawn's streets were less a terror and more a grim morning alarm. Some saw not waking up as a quiet mercy. Records from 13th century Italy mention people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, even riots, their bodies conditioned by relentless labor and meager meals. When you toiled from dawn to dusk, evading mud, taxes, and eternal judgment, sleep hit like a hammer. For some, it was an escape. Facing disease, loss, or yet another prediction of the world's end, prophesied roughly every few decades, people would wrap themselves in a cloak, whisper a prayer, and nod off, finding solace in oblivion. A 15th century English diary notes a widow taking to her bed to flee grief, a small act of defiance against a brutal world. Across the Atlantic centuries later, the winter of 1692 draped Salem, Massachusetts in more than ice. It cloaked the village in dread, suspicion, and a fear that crept into every timber-framed home.
The Puritans of Salem were a devout, rigid bunch, convinced they were forging a godly outpost in a wild land, watched by both heaven and hell. Life was already brutal. Crop failures, smallpox outbreaks, and skirmishes with native tribes left nerves frayed. Tensions simmered over land disputes, religious schisms, and resentment toward anyone who didn't fit the mold. The bitter New England cold only sharpened the edge. In this pressure cooker, something snapped in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began acting strangely, screaming, flailing, twisting into unnatural shapes or falling into eerie, silent stares. Neighbors muttered about curses. The girls claimed invisible forces pinched and bit them. When Dr. William Griggs found no medical cause, he declared witchcraft, a word that lit a match to Salem's already smoldering fears. In a community where the devil was as real as the frost, the idea that evil had infiltrated the minister's own house sent panic rippling outward. The accusation started small, but grew like wildfire. Betty, Abigail, and soon others, like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, escalated their behavior, convulsing in court, shrieking during prayers, claiming to see spectral figures tormenting the village. This wasn't just childish play. It was public, dramatic, and chillingly believed. The first targets were society's outcasts. Sarah Good, a pipe-smoking beggar who snapped at children, was an easy target. Her rough demeanor branded her a witch in a community that prized conformity. Sarah Osborne, raised eyebrows by skipping church for over a year and marrying her indentured servant after her first husband's death, a scandalous breach of social norms. Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados in Reverend Parris's household, was the most alien to the villagers. Her unfamiliar accent, vivid storytelling, and foreign folklore sparked fear. Under intense pressure, possibly even violence, Tituba confessed to witchcraft, spinning a tale of a shadowy man in black, a devilish figure who demanded she sign his book. She spoke of eerie creatures, yellow birds, red cats, spectral dogs, and, most explosively, claimed other witches lurked in Salem. Her confession didn't calm the storm. It unleashed a hurricane. A 1692 deposition records her words as a spark to the village's dread, igniting a frenzy of accusations. Neighbors turned on neighbors, old grudges cloaked as divine justice. A dead cow, witchcraft. A fussy baby during prayers, the devil's work. Fear spread like a contagion, silencing dissent. Defending an accused witch was a one-way ticket to suspicion. The village was ensnared in a web of paranoia where truth drowned in whispers.
As accusations spiraled, Massachusetts Governor William Phips, newly appointed and desperate to restore order, formed the Court of Oyer and Termiter to hear and determine in June 1692. This wasn't a bastion of justice, but a crucible of panic. The court leaned on a chilling innovation: spectral evidence, where testimony about a dream or vision of an accused person's spirit tormenting someone was admissible. If a girl claimed your ghostly form choked her in her sleep, that was enough, even if you were praying in church or miles away at the time. A 1692 court record notes such visions were treated as proof of diabolical acts. You couldn't argue with a dream or disprove a specter. The court's star witnesses were children. Their convulsions and screams grew more theatrical with each session. Mary Walcott, for instance, would collapse in fits the moment a supposed witch entered, shrieking whether they glanced her way or not. Judges, including Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, lopped it up.
There were no defense lawyers. Colonial trials didn't bother with them. Deny the charges, and the girls writhed harder. Confess and name others, and you might dodge the noose. The system thrived on betrayal and crushed silence. Trials became grim spectacles, drawing crowds from nearby towns to gawk at shackled defendants, often poor, confused, and defenseless. Whispers of doubt circulated. Some suspected the girls were play acting. Others questioned why only certain people were targeted. But few dared speak out. Challenging the court was like challenging God himself. On June 10, 1692, the gallows claimed their first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was no stranger to controversy, known for her bold red dresses, running a lively tavern, and a prior witchcraft accusation years earlier. At her trial, neighbors swore her spirit pinched them in the night, blamed her for infant deaths, and claimed she kept bewitched dolls. A 1692 testimony describes her as a woman of loose morals, marked by the devil's taint. Her fate was sealed in a courtroom where fear trumped reason, setting the stage for more executions.
On a desolate, wind-scoured hill outside Salem, Bridget Bishop faced the gallows on June 10, 1692. Despite her denials, the court convicted her, swayed by tales of spectral pinches and bewitched dolls. No prayers, no reprieve. The rope tightened, and with her death, a grim engine of execution roared to life. The killings accelerated. On July 19th, 5 women, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wildis met the noose. Rebecca Nurse, a devout elderly woman cherished by her community, was a stunning loss. Initially acquitted, Her jury buckled under pressure from judges and the writhing fits of the accuser girls, reversing the verdict. A 1692 trial record captures her final plea. "I am as guiltless as a newborn." The rope didn't care. August brought more hangings, and September 22nd became the deadliest day, with 8 lives snuffed out in a single morning. Among them were Martha Corey, an early skeptic of the trials, and her husband, Giles Corey, who faced a different fate.
Refusing to plead, Giles was subjected to peine forte et dure, an old English punishment. Over 3 agonizing days, stones were heaped on his chest until he gasped, "More weight," as legend holds. By the end, 19 were hanged, 1 crushed, and at least 5 perished in jail. Over 200 faced accusations, their lives upended by fear masquerading as justice. A 1692 letter from a Boston merchant laments, "The gallows' shadow darkens every soul in Salem." While the executions gripped the village, hundreds languished in squalid jails, cramped, reeking cells in Salem, Ipswich, and Boston. Chained to walls, they starved and shivered, often ordinary folk, neighbors, parents, even children, targeted by grudges cloaked in piety. A stray pig, a refused favor, a sickly child, any slight could be spun into witchcraft. Mary Esty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was a pious mother of 7. Freed once, she was rearrested after fresh fits from the girls, her fate sealed. Her final petition, recorded in 1692, begged not for her life, but for an end to the shedding of innocent blood. She was hanged soon after. Even children weren't spared. 4-year-old Dorcas Good, daughter of Sarah Good, was interrogated and, terrified, babbled a confession. Jailed for 8 months in chains, she emerged broken, her mind never whole again. Pregnant women like Elizabeth Proctor, wife of the hanged John Proctor, faced death sentences, but were spared temporarily due to their condition. Elizabeth gave birth in prison and survived when the trials collapsed. Accusations spiraled, fueled by confessions coerced to dodge the noose, each one naming new witches. Entire families were ensnared, and jails overflowed with the hungry and sick, some dying in the chaos of unchecked paranoia. In Salem, guilt was less about evidence and more about who dared point a finger. By autumn 1692, the fever of hysteria began to wane, not from newfound wisdom, but from sheer excess. Accusations grew so audacious, targeting even prominent figures, that cracks formed in the delusion. A 1692 pamphlet by Boston minister Increase Mather questioned spectral evidence, arguing, "It were better that 10 witches escape than 1 innocent suffer." The weight of death and doubt forced reality to creep back in, slowly unraveling the nightmare that had gripped Salem. The tide in Salem turned when the accusations grew too reckless, ensnaring even the untouchable. Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister, was arrested as the supposed mastermind of the witches. Educated and eloquent, his only crime was past disputes with powerful families. On August 19, 1692, he stood on Gallows Hill and, in a stunning act, recited the Lord's Prayer without a stumble, a feat witches were thought incapable of performing. A hush fell over the crowd. Some wept, others wavered, but the noose still tightened. A 1692 eyewitness account notes, "His prayer shook the hearts of many, yet justice was blind." That moment sowed seeds of doubt. Then, when accusations reached Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, the hysteria had climbed too high. Alarmed by mounting criticism and chaos, Phipps acted decisively in October 1692, dissolving the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting trials and executions. Prominent voices, once silent, began to challenge the madness. Increase Mather,
a leading Boston minister, condemned spectral evidence in a 1692 treatise, declaring, "Better 10 witches go free than one innocent soul perish." For a community that had cheered the gallows, this was a radical shift. Doubt spread, confessions dwindled, and accusers like the afflicted girls faded from the spotlight, some retracting their claims, others slipping into obscurity. The village, battered by its own fervor, began to question whether this was divine retribution or collective insanity. By late 1692, the judicial system that fueled the panic buckled under its own excesses. In January 1693, a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, replaced the disgraced Oyer and Terminer. Spectral evidence was banned, and judges approached claims with newfound skepticism. The result was striking. Of 56 cases tried, most defendants were acquitted. Even those who had confessed under duress began to recant, admitting torture or fear had forced their lies. The girls' theatrical fits, once the court's centerpiece, lost their grip, dismissed as unreliable.
The case of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister briefly suspected but never charged, underscored the absurdity. If a man of his stature could be targeted, no one was safe. A 1693 court record highlights the shift, noting a caution against rash judgments. Prisoners were quietly released, starting with those against whom evidence was flimsiest, eventually including confessed witches coerced into lies. Families of the executed fought back. John Proctor's children demanded his seized property, while Rebecca Nurse's kin campaigned to restore her honor. Shame replaced fear, splintering churches and friendships, unraveling Salem's social fabric. Governor Phipps, stung by the colony's growing infamy, issued pardons in 1693, emptying the jails. But freedom came with a cruel twist. Many had to pay their own jail fees, a final insult for those who'd lost homes, health, and loved ones. By the end, 19 had been hanged, 1 crushed under stones, 5 died in prison, and over 200 faced accusations. As you sink into your peaceful bed tonight, far from the shadow of gallows or the weight of false blame, be grateful for a world where sleep doesn't mean bracing for a neighbor's betrayal or a court's warped justice. When the court of Oyer and Terminer collapsed in late 1692, it left behind a wound that refused to heal. The trials were over, but Salem was a fractured village, scarred by loss, shame, and a reckoning with its own failures. The gallows stood silent, the jails emptied, yet peace was nowhere to be found. Guilt haunted the town, not from spectral witches, but from the wreckage of lives destroyed. Neighbors who once shared pews now avoided each other's gaze, their testimonies having turned prayer into betrayal. Some of the afflicted girls, like Ann Putnam Jr., slipped away from Salem. Others faded into obscurity. In 1706, Putnam stood before her church, tearfully confessing her role in the trials, blaming Satan's delusion, as recorded in a Danvers congregation record. Her apology offered little solace to families torn apart. Judge Samuel Sewell, a key figure in the trials, made a rare act of contrition in 1697, standing in church as his confession of error was read aloud, a moment of accountability few others dared to match, noted in a 1697 Boston church archive. For most, though, silence was easier than atonement. The families of the executed fought for justice, petitioning the Massachusetts government for pardons, property restoration, and recognition of their loved ones' innocence. In 1711, the colony passed a bill clearing some victims' names and offering modest compensation to their heirs, but it was incomplete.
Families like the Coreys and Proctors were overlooked, as a 1711 legislative record shows. Salem's shame became its identity, prompting the village to rename itself Danvers in a futile bid to outrun its past. Gallows Hill was left unmarked, as if erasing its location could erase the memory. Yet the story lingered, in sermons, whispered tales, and the strained silence between former friends.
Salem wasn't cursed by witches, but by fear, pride, and power unchecked, a shadow that clung long after the ropes were cut. The Salem witch trials, though centuries past, still resonate, not just in history books or guided tours, but in how we grapple with justice, fear, and truth's fragility. The events of 1692 weren't a mere outburst of hysteria, they were a collapse of reason, empathy, and fairness under panic's weight. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, even ministers, became executioners by trusting too readily and questioning too sparingly. Courts meant to uphold justice became engines of oppression. Faith was twisted into a weapon, testimony into performance, and silence into guilt. A 1693 letter from a Salem merchant reflects, fear turned neighbor against neighbor in months, not years. Old grudges cloaked as divine battles became death sentences. No demons were needed, just belief in them. Salem's lessons endured, shaping American legal principles. The U.S. Constitution, drafted decades later, banned ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, practices that had doomed Salem's accused. Rights to legal counsel, to confront accusers, and to demand tangible evidence were forged, partly from the trial's failures, as legal scholars noted in 18th century debates. The term witch hunt now signifies political persecution or moral panic, but its casual use often glosses over the real horror. A town where people were hanged for fictional crimes, betrayed by systems meant to protect them. As you rest in your quiet bed tonight, free from the fear of false accusations or the ghosts of a paranoid past, cherish the safety. Salem's true curse was human frailty, and its story warns us to guard against it still. Fear, when given free rein, can morph into a tyrant of its own making, especially when courts, churches, or governments grant it legitimacy. The Salem witch trials stand as a stark warning, not just of a village's spiral into chaos, but of how swiftly reason crumbles when fear is handed the reins. The gallows are long gone, the courtrooms silent, yet their lesson endures. Truth is delicate, justice is not a given, and history repeats unless we heed its scars.
A 1693 sermon from Boston warned, "Let Salem's shame teach us to guard our hearts against panic." As you drift into your peaceful bed tonight, free from the specter of baseless accusations, cherish the calm and remember, unchecked fear can unravel any society, no matter how devout or just it claims to be. Centuries earlier, in a world far from Salem's frosty fields, a woman named Fulvia emerged in Rome around 83 BCE. Born into the ambitious, slightly unconventional Fulvii family, a plebeian clan that had muscled its way into Rome's elite, the Fulvii boasted consuls, generals, and orators, but lacked the ancient prestige of patrician houses. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was more known for his stammer, mocked in his nickname meaning stumbler, than for political glory. Yet Fulvia was cut from sharper cloth. Raised in the heart of Rome's cutthroat politics, she grew up amid senators debating in her family's villa, elections won through cunning, and whispers of betrayal over wine.
Roman women of her class were expected to be polished, educated, and submissive, but Fulvia shattered that mold. Wealthy, Erudite and fearless, she absorbed the chaos of a republican freefall. Civil wars, populist uprisings, and power struggles between titans like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. A 1st century BCE historian, Velleius Paterculus, described her as a woman of fierce spirit, born to lead. Far from shrinking from Rome's turmoil, Fulvia learned to wield it, honing a political acumen that would make her a force in a man's world. Her first marriage, around the early 50s BCE, was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, a firebrand who thrived on chaos. Clodius wasn't just a noble, he was a populist showman, loved by the masses and loathed by the elite. Known for audacious stunts, like disguising himself as a woman to crash a female-only ritual at Caesar's house, he once renounced his patrician status to become a tribune of the plebs, gaining veto power over the Senate.
A 1st century BCE account by Cicero notes Clodius's knack for stirring Rome's streets into a frenzy. Fulvia didn't stand quietly by his side. She was his partner in every sense, engaging with his supporters, appearing at his campaigns, and turning their home into a nerve center for his populist agenda. Together, they formed a bold, brash power duo, unafraid to challenge Rome's traditions. Fulvia's sharp mind and unrelenting drive made her more than a consort. She was a strategist, ready to navigate and conquer the battlefield of Roman politics. Rome wasn't prepared for her, but she was more than ready for Rome. The murder of Publius Clodius Pulcher in 52 BCE on the Appian Way, cut down by his rival Titus Annius Milo's bodyguards, sent ripples of chaos through Rome. Fulvia, far from retreating into grief, turned her husband's death into a political weapon. She orchestrated a funeral that became a spectacle, parading Clodius's bloodied corpse to the forum, his wounds bared to ignite public fury.
A 1st century BCE account by Appian describes the scene. The people, stirred by Fulvia's display, set the Senate house ablaze. Riots erupted, and the city teetered on the edge of anarchy. This was no mere widow's lament. It was Fulvia's debut as a master of public sentiment, using grief as a spark for uprising. Her ability to wield spectacle, harness Clodius's populist legacy, and channel Rome's volatile emotions marked her as a formidable force. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had claimed the stage, and Rome would never underestimate her again. She didn't pause to mourn for long. In Rome's cutthroat arena, power faded quickly, and Fulvia knew it. Soon after Clodius's death, she married Gaius Scribonius Curio, a charismatic tribune and fervent ally of Julius Caesar. Curio was a showman with a flair for theatrics, but beneath the bravado lay a shrewd operator. As tribune in 50 BCE, he held sway during a fracturing republic caught between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's defiance. Fulvia's choice wasn't driven by romance, but strategy, a chance to anchor herself to a rising star and maintain her foothold in Rome's populist currents. A 1st century BCE text by Dio Cassius notes Curio's bold voice for the people, a cause Fulvia amplified. She rallied Clodius's old supporters, redirected their loyalty to Curio, and kept the urban masses engaged, ensuring her influence endured. When civil war erupted between Caesar and Pompey, Curio fought for Caesar, and Fulvia played her part, organizing resources and bolstering support, as hinted in a letter from Caesar's correspondence praising her unwavering resolve. But in 49 BCE, Curio's campaign in Africa ended in disaster, ambushed and slain by King Juba of Numidia's forces. Widowed again, Fulvia faced a Rome that expected her to fade. Instead, she emerged stronger, a political survivor forged by loss and unrest. Her third marriage, around 47 BCE, was her boldest yet, to Mark Antony, Caesar's brash, ambitious general. This wasn't just a union, it was a power merger. Antony, climbing the ranks through military prowess and political gambits, needed Fulvia's street savvy and populist clout to secure Rome while he campaigned.
Fulvia, twice widowed and seasoned by betrayal, brought unmatched political acumen. A 1st century BCE account by Plutarch describes their partnership. Antony found in Fulvia a mind as sharp as his own. Together, they were a force. Antony's charisma and legions paired with Fulvia's knack for rallying crowds and navigating alliances. She didn't merely support him, she acted with unprecedented authority for a Roman woman, opening his letters, issuing directives in his absence, and shaping his political appointments. Hostile sources, like Cicero, painted her as domineering, even ruthless, but their bias only underscores her impact. Fulvia wasn't just Antony's wife. She was his strategist, holding his faction together in a crumbling republic. As you rest in your quiet bed tonight, free from the weight of political funerals or the schemes of a fracturing empire, marvel at Fulvia's audacity, a woman who turned loss into power and chaos into opportunity. In a Rome that revered male dominance, Fulvia's audacity shocked the elite, not because she sought power, but because she wielded it like a man. After Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic descended into a maelstrom of rivalries and power grabs. As Mark Antony scrambled to claim Caesar's mantle, forming the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia became his anchor in Rome. She wasn't just a supportive wife, she was his political proxy, orchestrating patronage, rallying street factions, and keeping Antony's base energized. A 1st century BCE coin, rare for its time, bore her name alongside Antony's, a bold testament to her influence. To cement the shaky triumvirate, she arranged her daughter Clodia's marriage to Octavian, a strategic move that later unraveled. Far from a silent partner, Fulvia stood in the spotlight of power, managing Rome's volatile streets with a deft hand. A text by Appian notes, Fulvia held Antony's cause in Rome as fiercely as he did in the field. While Antony campaigned abroad, Fulvia was his de facto regent, navigating a city ruled by violence, bribes, and raw influence. She outmaneuvered senators, courted the urban plebs, and secured loyalty with coin and charisma.
Hostile sources like Cicero and Dio Cassius branded her manipulative or bloodthirsty, their misogyny barely masking her impact. She funded troops, swayed legislation to favor Antony, and built ties with veteran soldiers, a crucial power base in the Republic's twilight. A letter from a 1st century BCE centurion praises her for ensuring the legion's loyalty with silver and promises. Fulvia's public role, meeting commanders, influencing land grants, and issuing orders, was a revolutionary for a Roman woman, stepping into roles reserved for consuls. But her power drew enemies. Octavian's faction, wary of her sway over Rome's streets and legions, saw her as a threat to tradition and their own ambitions. Her ability to act without a male guardian wasn't just bold, it was a direct challenge to Rome's patriarchal order. By 41 BCE, Fulvia saw the cracks in Antony's alliance with Octavian widening, and sensed the Republic couldn't hold both men's egos. Diplomacy was failing. Confrontation loomed. With Antony in the east, Fulvia took a breathtaking step. She launched a war against Octavian.
Alongside Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother and a consul, she raised a rebellion in Italy, officially to protect Antony's interests and veterans' land rights. But the campaign bore Fulvia's unmistakable mark, a calculated escalation from politics to warfare. A 1st century BCE account by Plutarch calls her the spark of the Perusian War, noting her role in rallying troops and resources. This wasn't just a defense of her husband. It was Fulvia seizing the reins of power, leading a military revolt as no Roman woman had before. As you slip into your quiet bed tonight, free from the weight of a crumbling empire or the clash of armies, marvel at Fulvia's nerve, a woman who didn't just navigate Rome's chaos, but reshaped it, sword in hand. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did what no Roman woman had ever done. She sparked a civil war. The Perusian War erupted over Octavian's land redistribution, which uprooted Italians to reward his veterans, fueling widespread resentment. Fulvia saw opportunity in the anger, framing Octavian as a betrayer of Caesar's legacy.
With Lucius Antonius, Mark Antony's brother and a consul, as her public face, she orchestrated a rebellion, raising 8 legions and seizing Perusia, modern Perugia. Ancient sources, like Appian's 1st century BCE account, credit Fulvia as the driving force. She was the fire behind the war, more resolute than Lucius. She rallied troops, stirred public outrage, and corresponded with generals, her influence undeniable despite rumors of her pushing Lucius into battles he hesitated to fight. Octavian, caught off guard, responded with force, besieging Perusia through the harsh winter of 41 to 40 BCE. Cut off from supplies, Fulvia watched her bold plan crumble as starvation and defections took hold. By early 40 BCE, Perusia fell. Lucius was spared, likely to appease Antony, but Fulvia was deemed too dangerous. Exiled to Sicyon, Greece, she was cast out of Rome. A woman who had commanded riots, marriages, and armies, now banished for her audacity. In Sicyon, a haven for Rome's political outcasts, Fulvia faced not acclaim, but isolation. She had waged war in Antony's name, believing she was safeguarding his power and their shared vision.
Yet Antony, distracted in Egypt with Cleopatra, offered no swift reunion. Whether their romance had ignited or was merely simmering, the contrast stung. Fulvia raised legions, while Antony raised cups at lavish feasts. A 1st century BCE text by Plutarch suggests Antony was furious at her unauthorized war, while others hint he saw her downfall as a chance to pivot toward a new alliance with Octavian. Betrayed and alone, Fulvia's health faltered. In 40 BCE, at around 43 years old, she died in Sicyon, perhaps from illness, exhaustion, or a broken spirit. Her death handed Antony a political escape. Soon after, he sealed peace with Octavian by marrying his sister, Octavia, a move Fulvia's fierce loyalty would have opposed. A letter from a loyal centurion, preserved in a 1st century BCE archive, mourned her as Antony's truest shield, abandoned. Fulvia's legacy was soon eclipsed by Cleopatra's mythos, but she was the trailblazer. No Roman woman before her had wielded such open power, leading revolts, commanding loyalty, and defying a world that saw women as mere props.
Rome, unable to contain her, sought to erase her, yet the embers of her rebellion glowed on. As you rest in your quiet bed tonight, far from the clash of legions or the sting of exile, marvel at Fulvia, a woman who seized power in a man's world and paid the ultimate price, leaving a legacy too bold to be fully forgotten. After Fulvia's death, her enemies shaped her story, casting her as the villain of the Perusian War and the chaos that fractured Rome. Historians like Appian, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch, often writing from the perspective of Octavian's allies, branded her as domineering, envious, and power-mad. They pinned the war, the Antony-Octavian rift, and the Republic's turmoil on her, claiming she goaded Lucius Antonius into conflict and drove Antony's missteps. A 1st century BCE text by Dio Cassius sneers Fulvia stirred war where men sought peace. Yet this was hardly just. Fulvia's ambition and aggression mirrored Caesar's or Pompey's, and she was far less ruthless than Octavian, who would later cement his power through bloodshed.
Her true crime? Acting like a Roman man in a world unprepared for a woman who commanded armies, penned orders to generals, and rallied mobs. Mark Antony, whose cause she championed, used her death as a political reset, blaming her for the strife to secure his truce with Octavian through marriage to Octavia. No statues honored Fulvia, no orations mourned her, just silence. But her mark was indelible. As the first Roman woman with her name on coinage, not as a goddess, but a political force, she defied erasure. A 1st century BCE coin inscription bearing Fulvia speaks louder than her critics' scorn. She refused to vanish, her defiance echoing through history's pages if you look past the slander. Fulvia's story closed in quiet, but her legacy roars. Rome struggled to fit her into its narrative because she shattered every expectation of womanhood. Where women were meant to wield influence through subtle whispers or strategic marriages, Fulvia bellowed through policy, rebellion, and spectacle.
She wasn't a passive consort, but a commander who shaped elections, forged alliances, and led a civil war. Roman historians, unsettled by her refusal to stay in the shadows, caricatured her as disruptive and shrill. Yet a clearer image emerges, a woman who minted coins in her name, mastered street politics, and navigated the Republic's collapse with unmatched skill. A 1st century BCE account by Appian credits her with binding Antony's faction through sheer will. Her downfall wasn't failure, but timing and gender. Had she been a man, she might have been hailed as a rival to Caesar. Instead, she was cast as the woman who overreached. Her influence, though, paved the way for later figures like Livia Drusilla and Agrippina the Younger, who wielded power in her shadow, and even Cleopatra, whose legend owes a nod to Fulvia's trailblazing. Modern historians now see her not as a cautionary tale, but as a pioneer, one of Rome's most politically dynamic women, who stretched the limits of female power and paid dearly for it.
As you rest in your quiet bed tonight, free from the weight of a republic's collapse or the sting of history's rewrite, honor Fulvia, a woman whose bold defiance reshaped Rome even as it tried to forget her. She didn't merely exist in an era of towering obstacles, she defied them. While the Roman Empire sought to obliterate her legacy, Fulvia's influence lingered in every fracture of its downfall. Not a mere shadow in history, but a catalyst, a woman whose vision transcended her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States stood at a crossroads, caught between entrenched traditions and a yearning for transformation. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just custom, it was codified. African Americans were excluded from diners, classrooms, public transit, polling stations, and even water fountains. Police violence was a grim reality. Lynchings persisted in the shadows, and in cities like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful demonstrators faced snarling police dogs and brutal fire hoses. Yet, a tide of change was rising, unyielding and unstoppable.
In just a few years, the civil rights movement had ignited a national awakening. Lunch counter sit-ins, freedom rides, and economic boycotts dominated news cycles. Figures like Rosa Parks,
Medgar Evers and John Lewis had become more than individuals. They were emblems of resistance. The March on Washington didn't emerge from a single spark. It was forged in decades of mounting frustration and unshakable hope. African Americans were done waiting for justice. They were ready to demand it, and they chose the nation's capital as their stage. The concept of a massive march on Washington, D.C. had roots stretching back decades. A. Philip Randolph, a seasoned labor leader and civil rights visionary, first proposed a similar demonstration in the 1940s to push President Franklin D. Roosevelt to desegregate wartime industries. That plan was shelved when Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defense hiring. But in 1963, the stakes were monumental. Randolph, alongside strategists like Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., rekindled the idea.
This time, the march wasn't just about jobs. It was a clarion call for dignity, voting rights, integrated schools, fair wages, and the fundamental right to live without fear. Over a dozen civil rights groups, despite ideological differences, united under a shared conviction: solidarity could amplify their voice. The countdown was on. Buses were chartered, pamphlets circulated, and word spread like wildfire. Across the nation, African Americans prepared for a moment that would etch itself into history. The dream was taking form, step by resolute step. Organizing a protest in Washington, D.C. was daunting enough, but orchestrating one for over 100,000 people, potentially far more, was a Herculean task. The logistics were staggering. Securing food, water, transportation, sound equipment, sanitation facilities, medical support, permits, crowd management, and safety protocols. Yet, against all odds, it came together. At the heart of this intricate operation was Bayard Rustin, a brilliant tactician, often sidelined due to his open homosexuality, but indispensable to the movement. Rustin had honed his nonviolent philosophy under the tutelage of Gandhi's disciples in India, endured arrests, beatings, and FBI surveillance, yet remained unshaken. For him, the March on Washington was a chance to demonstrate the power of disciplined, nonviolent action executed with precision. In a mere 8 weeks, Rustin and his team turned a bold vision into reality. Officially named the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the event was carefully crafted to champion both racial equality and economic justice. This dual focus was intentional. While Dr. King would later embody the day's moral resonance, Randolph and Rustin ensured the agenda addressed unemployment, a living wage, and labor rights alongside civil rights. Recent research highlights the march's economic demands as a precursor to later anti-poverty campaigns, emphasizing how 1963 marked a pivotal moment in linking racial and economic justice. Beneath the surface, tensions brewed. President John F. Kennedy's administration was on edge, haunted by fears of riots, violence, or political fallout. Civil rights leaders vowed the demonstration would remain peaceful, but the government took no chances. The National Guard was mobilized. D.C. hospitals were placed on high alert, and alcohol sales were halted for the day. The stage was set for a historic confrontation, not of fists, but of ideals. Federal employees were quietly encouraged to stay home, a subtle nod to the government's unease. Unity, too, posed a formidable challenge. The Big Six civil rights organizations,
NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters often diverged sharply on strategy. Some, like SNCC's fiery young activists, pushed for bolder, more confrontational tactics, growing restless with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to nonviolence. Others favored negotiation and restraint. Yet, despite these rifts, they shared a singular resolve. The era of quiet endurance was over. The time for action had arrived.
Bayard Rustin's blueprint for the march resembled a general's battle plan. Every bus and train route was meticulously mapped. Speakers were allotted precise time slots. Trained marshals, equipped with nonviolent crowd control techniques, stood ready at every turn. This wasn't merely a demonstration, it was a carefully choreographed moment designed to stir the nation's moral conscience. Rustin's team, aware of the global spotlight, aimed to showcase the power of unity and discipline. Historical accounts note that Rustin's logistical genius drew on his experience organizing smaller protests, ensuring every detail, from portable toilets to first aid stations, was accounted for. On August 28, 1963, a sultry Wednesday in Washington, D.C., the air was thick with heat and humidity, clinging to the skin like a damp veil. Yet nothing could deter the masses.
From every region of the nation, they poured in, black and white, young and old, students and clergy, laborers and luminaries. Some donned their finest clothes, others gripped handmade signs proclaiming justice. By bus, train, carpool, and even on foot, over 250,000 souls converged on the National Mall, a swelling river of determination. Remarkably, order prevailed. Despite the government's dread of chaos, the scene was serene, almost sacred. Volunteers guided the crowds with calm efficiency. Red Cross workers distributed water to parched marchers. Near the reflecting pool, gospel hymns mingled with chants of freedom now, reverberating off the Lincoln Memorial's stone pillars. Celebrities lent their presence not for fame, but for solidarity. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan stood among the throng, their voices amplifying a shared cause. Yet the day belonged to the ordinary people, those who had traveled hundreds of miles, who stood shoulder to shoulder in the heat, united by a purpose greater than themselves. There was no shoving, no looting, no violence, only a collective understanding that this was more than a march.
For African Americans, standing on the Mall, in the shadow of Lincoln's statue, was a quiet act of defiance, a declaration of presence in a nation that had long sought to render them invisible. Historians note that the march's diversity, racial, religious, and economic, underscored its universal appeal, setting it apart from earlier protests. At noon, the program commenced with precision. Leaders from across the civil rights spectrum took the stage, each voice weaving a tapestry of demands: fair wages, integrated schools, an end to police violence, and a federal commitment to equality. Mahalia Jackson's soul-stirring gospel rang out, followed by Marian Anderson, whose performance decades earlier had been barred from Constitution Hall due to her race. Now, under an open sky, her voice soared, a testament to resilience. As the afternoon wore on, anticipation built, not from fear, but from the electric promise of what was to come. The crowd knew the day's crescendo was near, and every eye turned toward the man who would define it.
By mid-afternoon, a hush fell over the multitude, not from exhaustion, but from expectation. In the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium, his dark suit crisp despite the heat, his demeanor a blend of solemnity and resolve. He carried a prepared speech, drafted with advisors late into the previous night, grounded in the stark realities of segregation, systemic violence, and unfulfilled promises. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, he declared, the Negro remains shackled. His voice, rich with cadence, wove together scripture, history, and moral urgency, holding the crowd in rapt silence. Some nodded in agreement, others clutched signs reading, "Equality now," and many wiped tears from their eyes. Then, a pivotal moment unfolded, one that would etch the day into history. Mahalia Jackson, standing nearby after her earlier performance, called out, "Share the dream, Martin!" Her words, spontaneous yet profound, sparked something extraordinary.
King set aside his script, tapping into a vision he had articulated in earlier sermons. What followed would not only define the march, but reshape the trajectory of the civil rights movement, reverberating through generations. At Mahalia Jackson's urging, "Share the dream, Martin," Dr. King set aside his carefully prepared text. He grasped the podium, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, and unleashed a vision he had voiced in smaller settings, but never with such transcendent power. "I hold a dream," he proclaimed, and the crowd leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. "I hold a dream that this nation will one day embody the full promise of its founding creed." His words grew bolder, sharper, imbued with unshakable conviction. "I hold a dream that the descendants of enslaved people and those of enslavers will one day share a table of kinship. I hold a dream that my 4 children will live in a land where their character, not their skin, defines them." This was no longer a speech, it was a beacon, a sacred call, a thunderclap echoing through time. When he concluded with, "Free at last, thank God we are free at last," the crowd erupted in a wave of cheers, tears, and jubilation. They knew they had witnessed not just eloquence, but a prophecy that would resonate for generations. Historical analyses note that King's improvisation, spurred by Jackson's prompt, drew on sermons he'd delivered in Detroit and Chicago, crystallizing his vision into a universal anthem. The March on Washington's power lay not only in its oratory or music, but in its people. Over 250,000 strong, they converged from every corner of America. Mississippi's Delta, Michigan's factories, Alabama's fields, New York's streets, California's coast. Some were battle-hardened activists, veterans of countless protests. Others were first-time marchers who'd never ventured beyond their hometowns. They packed sandwiches, endured grueling bus rides, some lasting over 24 hours, and slept in their best clothes to stand on the National Mall. Maids, educators, steelworkers, postal workers, they weren't politicians, but they were the heartbeat of change. Their presence was their testimony. Among them were children, their eyes wide with wonder. Young black girls with ribbons woven into their braids, boys clutching signs scrawled in crayon, and toddlers perched on parents' shoulders, gazing toward the Lincoln Memorial as voices boomed through loudspeakers. For them, this wasn't just a moment.
It was the dawn of a reimagined world. Recent scholarship highlights how the march's intergenerational presence underscored its forward-looking hope, with families planting seeds for a future they might not live to see. Certain figures stood out in the throng. John Lewis, a 23-year-old firebrand from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, delivered a speech that nearly didn't happen as planned. His original draft, searing in its call for radical reform, alarmed senior leaders who feared it might alienate allies. Minutes before he spoke, Lewis reluctantly softened his words, but his demand for urgent change still electrified the crowd.
Then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to address the march, reading a statement on behalf of women in the movement. Her brief but potent words highlighted a painful truth. Even in a fight for equality, women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height were often relegated to the margins. Bates, an Arkansas activist who had braved death threats to integrate schools, embodied their resilience. The crowd also included union leaders, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students from diverse backgrounds. Their differences in strategy, some drawn to King's nonviolence, others to Malcolm X's militancy, set aside for a day of unity. It was a vivid mosaic of possibility. Black and white hands clasped, Freedom Now pins gleaming, and 250,000 voices rising as one. They weren't just spectators, they were architects of history. Yet beneath the day's triumphant surface, the March on Washington was a fragile triumph, held together by grit, compromise, and relentless effort. Bayard Rustin, the logistical genius behind it, faced unrelenting scrutiny.
His open homosexuality and past ties to communism made him a target, not just from external critics, but within the movement. Historical records reveal that Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. once threatened to smear Rustin and King with false rumors of a romantic relationship, a shadow that loomed over the march's planning. Rustin's resilience in navigating these attacks while coordinating a monumental event remains a testament to his brilliance. Equally contentious was the sidelining of women. Despite the pivotal roles of figures like Ella Baker, who mentored SNCC's young leaders, and Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, the organizers, under pressure to project a unified image, limited women's visibility. Bates' speech, though powerful, was a compromise, a nod to critics who decried the absence of female voices on the main stage. Rosa Parks stood among the throng that day, a revered figure whose quiet defiance on a Montgomery bus had sparked a movement, yet she was not invited to speak.
Beneath the march's stirring unity lay a stark reality. The civil rights struggle grappled with its own contradictions and oversights. Tensions simmered within the Big Six organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNACP, SCLC, National Urban League, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. SNACP's young radicals, frustrated by the sluggish pace of reform, chafed at the older guard's calls for patience. They yearned to confront systemic racism head-on, while CORE shared their restlessness for bolder action. For one day, however, unity trumped discord, as the leaders recognized the power of a collective stand. The federal government observed with bated breath. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI deployed over 100 agents to shadow organizers, tapping hotel phones, trailing key figures, and amassing dossiers. Convinced the march would erupt in violence or fall prey to communist influence, they prepared for the worst. When the day unfolded peacefully, their suspicions didn't waver. Instead, they intensified their scrutiny, particularly of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who became a prime target of Hoover's surveillance campaign.
Historical records reveal the FBI's COINTELPRO program labeled King a threat, escalating wiretapping and smear tactics in the years that followed. Then there was the matter of funding. The march's price tag exceeded $250,000, roughly $2.5 million in 2025 dollars, covered through a patchwork of union contributions, individual donors, and last-minute fundraising. Organizers even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts to coordinate the sprawling event. The March on Washington was a triumph of human will, but it was also raw, imperfect, and fraught with political maneuvering. Like the nation it sought to transform, it was a work in progress, shaped by sweat, compromise, and resolve. As the sun dipped behind the Washington Monument, the crowd lingered, reluctant to leave a space that felt hallowed. Strangers embraced, voices lifted in song, and tears mingled with hope. The speeches had been delivered, the signs held aloft, and the world had borne witness.
Yet, as marchers dispersed, a question lingered in the humid August air. What comes next? In the days that followed, media coverage was guardedly optimistic. Major outlets praised the event's discipline, often with a backhanded nod. No riots occurred. Few delved into the march's specific demands, such as a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to about $20 in 2025. But Dr. King's speech was inescapable. Its vision of unity splashed across headlines worldwide. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially resisted the march, watched its broadcast with a mix of awe and relief. He later met with civil rights leaders at the White House, calling the event a testament to democracy. Yet his proposed Civil Rights Act remained stalled, entangled in Southern congressional opposition. Some activists left Washington disheartened, expecting swifter results. The grind of organizing, protesting, and mourning continued. Just weeks later, on September 15, 1963, tragedy struck. A bomb at Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church killed 4 black girls, a brutal reminder that the dream was still shadowed by violence.
Still, the march marked a turning point. It demonstrated that mass protest could be disciplined, resonant, and undeniable. It forged an unprecedented coalition: labor unions, religious leaders, celebrities, students, and everyday workers, united for justice. Above all, it gave the movement an enduring voice: King's dream, a vision that would be taught, quoted, and revered globally. Historical analyses note that the march's interracial alliance laid the groundwork for broader civil rights coalitions, influencing future campaigns like the Poor People's Campaign. The march didn't secure instant victories, but it ignited momentum. Less than a year later, on July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing segregation in public places and employment discrimination. The act, while imperfect, was a direct descendant of the march's moral force, proving that collective action could reshape a nation's trajectory. The March on Washington didn't just challenge America's conscience, it redefined its moral horizon, cementing its place as a cornerstone of the civil rights legacy and a testament to the power of unified voices demanding change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 dismantled segregation in public spaces and prohibited discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck a decisive blow against Jim Crow's barriers to the ballot box. Would these landmark laws have passed without the March on Washington? Perhaps. But would they have carried the same moral weight, the same tidal wave of public demand? Unlikely. Historical analyses suggest the march's visibility, broadcast globally via television, amplified pressure on Congress, transforming a stalled bill
into a national imperative. For Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the "I Have a Dream" speech catapulted him from a respected leader to a global symbol of justice. Yet this ascent came at a steep price. FBI surveillance intensified, with wiretaps and smear campaigns dogging his every move. Death threats multiplied, and in 1968, his assassination in Memphis cemented the speech's poignancy, rendering it both a beacon of hope and a tragic prophecy. King's words, delivered on the Lincoln Memorial steps, grew more revered with time, etched into the collective conscience.
The march's impact rippled far beyond America's borders. It offered a blueprint for mass mobilization, inspiring anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, student demonstrators in Europe, and human rights advocates worldwide. Leaders like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu drew parallels to their own struggles, while global protests from India to Latin America echoed the march's disciplined, nonviolent ethos. The march's dual demand for racial and economic justice, often overlooked, set a precedent for intersectional activism, influencing movements like the fight for $15 in the 21st century. The legacy of August 28, 1963, endures not just in history, but in the pulse of modern protest. From the Million Man March of 1995 to Black Lives Matter demonstrations, the imagery of 250,000 united voices reverberates in every rally, every sign scrawled with demands for justice. Across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial now stands, its granite form inscribed with excerpts from that day's speech. Yet the true monument lies not in stone, but in classrooms, voting booths, and the courage of those who continue to march.
The dream was never meant to be confined to archives. It was a call to action, meant to be lived. More than 6 decades later, the March on Washington is enshrined in textbooks, documentaries, and museum displays. King's voice, resonant and unwavering, remains a touchstone in national memory. But the question persists: has the dream been fulfilled or merely postponed? Progress is undeniable. Segregation's legal scaffolding has crumbled. Voting rights, though now threatened by restrictive laws in states like Georgia and Texas, were secured through decades of struggle. The election of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and a 2-term black president, Barack Obama, marked milestones unimaginable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once outlawed in 16 states, is now a protected right. Yet the march's original demands, often eclipsed by King's soaring rhetoric, linger unfulfilled. The call for a living wage remains elusive, with the federal minimum wage stagnant at $7.25 since 2009, far below the $2, roughly $20 in 2025, demanded in 1963. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare persist, with studies showing Black Americans face unemployment rates nearly double those of white Americans. Police violence, a catalyst for the civil rights era, continues to fuel outrage, from Ferguson in 2014 to Minneapolis in 2020. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter carry the march's torch, blending its imagery with new tools, social media, viral hashtags, and decentralized organizing to demand systemic change. The March on Washington was never the final chapter. It was a spark, a bold declaration of identity and demands. It proclaimed, "We are here, and this is what we seek." Its dream, battered, reimagined, but undying, lives on. Whether it is deferred or realized hinges not on history, but on the present. The injustices we challenge, the unity we forge, and the resolve we muster to march again until the dream becomes a shared reality for all.